everyone, welcome back to the channel and Happy New Year! My name is Muriel and in this very first video of 2024 I will be doing my 2023 reading wrap-up. So in 2023 I read 86 books. That weren't all great. I think overall I had a pretty mixed reading year. I didn't acquire many new favorites for one thing, especially as compared to 2022. Conversely, I didn't read so many books that were awful or even that bad. There were bad books, but not too many of them. On the rereading front though, I had some excellent rereads. Honestly, I think I had more enjoyable rereads than new reads, perhaps. Well, no, not entirely, but like, in the section of my video that will focus on the best of the best, there's a not insignificant number of rereads. Now, before I move into the actual meat of the video, a quick reminder that I'm just going to essentially follow the same formula I've been following since 2020, I think. So I'm going to cut up the video into sections focusing on noteworthy reads, the worst of the worst, the best of the best. Oh, and also I'm actually going to start with the non-fiction, and to be more precise here, the noteworthy non-fiction I read in 2023. I won't be going in any particular chronological order, though I'll do my best to state when I read the following books. So this I actually read at the start of 2023, The Penguin Lessons by Tom Michell. This was a gift from my bestest bookish friend. It is a memoir focusing on the relationship between a penguin and the man who adopted him after rescuing him from a horrible oil spill. It wasn't Argentina, it was somewhere in South America, but the story, the real life story principally takes place in Argentina because the author went to teach at a boarding school then like the 1970s. And it was very sweet and endearing. So yeah, I enjoyed it. I didn't enjoy it quite as much as I have other such memoirs, focusing on relationships between humans and birds, and you know, the kinds of birds I love even more than penguins, I think owls or corvids, because I wanted this to focus even more on the bird-human relationship, and then perhaps penguin biology, penguin ecology, but there's a fair bit about Argentinian socio-political economic history, which wasn't fundamentally uninteresting, but it's not what I wanted. So yeah, I wanted more penguin, more burb. Otherwise, I'm still happy I read this, and it was a lovely gift from my friend. Then quite soon after that one, I read this, Tomorrow's Sex Will Be Good Again by Katherine Angel. It's a bind-up of 4 feminist essays, and it specifically focuses on consent rhetoric and the limitations of it with regards to preventing toxic power dynamics in, here specifically, heterosexual relationships and abusive behaviors, rape culture, etc. And I really love this because 3 out of the 4 essays, which is stellar, like, think 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10 essays. The 4th one kind of jumped off a cliff, unfortunately, but still, overall this was a solid 8 out of 10 read. Because yes, I enjoyed the author's argumentation. She analyzed through a critical lens some of the popular science, psychology that has come out in these past few years about specifically female sexuality, about the way it supposedly works, but she kind of looks at it and points the obvious issues with those studies and how people in, well, popular culture have run away with them, and that issues I have had myself for a long time, and it really hammers home the point that sexuality is culture-bound for everyone, both men and women. That last essay, like I said, was not so good at all, but I would still very highly recommend this one just for the first 3 essays. Towards the end of the year, I read Bell Hooks's The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love, a book that looks at masculinity and how this affects men's relationships, men's experience of love, attachment, etc. But it was too much of an essay for my taste. I wanted something with more evidence behind it because Hooks made quite a few grand claims that just triggered my itch to go, citation needed. Like, I really need some sources here. Not that I always fundamentally disagreed with her points. I agreed with most of them, to be honest. It's just that at times she lacked, for my taste, once again, nuance in her arguments. Also, I do believe this book was primarily written for men, and that is entirely legitimate, but I guess that's not what I was looking for exactly. And it was also a bit disjointed, structurally speaking. I felt it was longer than it actually needed to be. I think towards the middle of the year, I read this, Bitch, or What Does It Mean to Be Female, written by Lucy Cooke. And this is a book about female zoology, and specifically interested in tackling a lot of misconceptions and stereotypes surrounding the female animal, tackling sexist bias in the natural sciences, you know, things of that general order. I really enjoyed this one. It really approaches a lot of, well, I guess, you know, specifically those stereotypes about the female animal and about female psychology, which is attributed to women, but then is back projected onto other female animals, especially female mammals. And the author interviews a lot of female scientists who are doing their best with their research to deconstruct some of these stereotypes and show that actually, you know what, female behavior in nature is varied, polymorphous, variegated. It's beautifully diverse, right? The one big issue I had with this is that I thought it did a very poor job of actually explaining what sex is from a biological standpoint. Like, what is sexual reproduction with regards to like gametes, where it comes from, its evolutionary history, etc. I guess at times it does focus a little too much on, you know, scientific discourse and the ways we do science rather than giving information about female animals, although the balance wasn't that bad overall. And yes, I had a gripe with the very last chapter because that very last chapter just gets a bit out there with the queer theory trademark stuff, and I just can't with that. So for me, it was trash bin worthy, but your mileage will vary there undoubtedly. Otherwise, no, very solid read, and I would definitely recommend it. Last year, I also did a fair bit of reading about witchcraft, female-centric paganism and or neo-paganism, how that intersects with mythology, folklore, that kind of stuff. Just my shit, 1000%. And the two books that stood out to me the most were Ronald Hutton's The Witch and Max Dashu's Witches and Pagans. These two paired very nicely because The Witch is Professor Hutton's look at the figure of the satanic witch in Europe in the early modern era. It's a history book, right? He's a historian, and so he looks at this topic through the lens of very rigorous historical analysis. There's a fair bit of historiography in there as well. Shout out to my boyfriend for teaching me about that word and that discipline, because I actually mentioned this in the reading wrap-up in which I talked about The Witch, or like, there's a lot of writing about the way people did history and folklore studies. That is actually historiography, basically. So there's a fair bit of that in there. It's very dry reading in places, and like I said, it's for nerds. 1,000,000,000%, this is the book for nerds. It's quite academic in tone. It also means it's really good. And then you have Max Dashu's book, which takes a much more holistic approach to the topic of female-centric pagan spirituality and religion, once again focused on Europe. I wanted a multidisciplinary approach to the topic of the witch, and this is that, although it was just written by one person, but a beautifully self-taught individual who really touches upon lots of different things: linguistics, archaeological evidence, historical record, etc., etc. So love this, and so paired with like the academic rigorousness of The Witch, had a beautiful plunge into that beloved topic of mine. And then I'll mention once again, Late in the Day, Poems 2010 to 2014, written by Ursula K. LeGuin, because this is the very first collection of poetry I've read by her, but it's also the first bit of non-fiction I've read by LeGuin, and this was a gift from my boyfriend. It's the first thing he ever gave to me, so it's very special in that regard, of course. And I really enjoyed this. I can be pretty difficult with poetry, especially with free verse, or things that are closer to free verse than standard verse. But no, I really enjoyed this collection. I enjoyed a lot, most actually, of the poems in it. There are also a couple of essays written by LeGuin in here. I mean, there's an introduction, there's an afterword, but then there's also a transcription of a speech she gave when she was awarded a medal for contribution to American letters, something like that. I'm quite excited to read an actual collection of essays written by LeGuin this coming year, but this was lovely. Now I'm going to delve into the noteworthy fiction of 2023. First, I'm going to mention Ruby Dixon's Ice Planet Barbarians. It is what in my opinion is meme erotica, meme science fiction erotica about a woman who, through rather dire circumstances, finds herself on an ice planet and is rescued by a big, blue, horny and horned alien named Vector. And it was fun. I really didn't expect to like this. I didn't love it, right? But it was fun. And I had a lot of fun reviewing it. So there very much is a review for this one, and just memeing liberally about it, going through the issues I had with the world building. And discussing the smuttiness, right? Because it very much is erotica, although it is also a romance. I rated it with 6 blue eggplants out of 10. Yes, I did. I won't read the rest of the series. That being said, I just might read some more meme erotica in the future for funsies. Then together I will mention What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher and Spear, written by Nicola Griffith, because both were honestly solid and solidly enjoyable retellings, and female-centric or female-reworked kind of retellings. What Moves the Dead is The Fall of the House of Usher retelling, so, you know, a retelling of the original Edgar Allan Poe short story. And the second is a retelling of the Percival storyline / motif within the greater Arthurian mythos. And here Percival is female, so it's a gender-swapped retelling as well. They were quite short, they didn't have that much thematic, or any really thematic depth, or much to the respective world buildings. But I had a good time with them, and, you know, they didn't make me cringe, or they didn't try to sell themselves as, like, super powerful feminist retellings, herder. And with Spear, there was actually good historical world building, I will give it that, and there was seamlessly woven lesbian representation. And then with What Moves the Dead, it was effective horror fiction with fungal shenanigans. So yay! Then over the months of June and July, I think it was, I read Octavia E. Butler's Xenogenesis trilogy, with book 1 being Dawn, book 2 being Adulthood Rights, and book 3 being Imago. This trilogy features rapey aliens. Is how I'll oversimplify it, I suppose. No, but yes, you have a post-apocalyptic future. Humans almost kill themselves because, you know, nuclear warfare and whatnot, but they are kind of sort of rescued by the Oankali, a species of spacefaring tentacled, yes, aliens who have 3, not 2 reproductive categories, and they want to make babies with the humans for their own selfish reasons, like, will die on that hill. And so the story revolves around the developing relationship between humanity and the Oankali. I enjoy this up to a point. I think there is beautiful, in the sense of beautifully relentless and deeply executed, theming on colonialism, genocide, and sexual violence and grooming. And, you know, that with the former 2. So it's very dark. But mad respect to Butler for what she accomplished with this trilogy. Unfortunately, I had issues with the character work, with the gendered character psychology, which was really off-putting. And then some of the theming itself in places just went into a direction that stank of genetic determinism in a way where I wasn't entirely sure if I was supposed to, like, side with the aliens take. And then there's nothing for it. Book 3 is absolutely fucking pointless, because by the time you get to book 3, by the time I got to book 3 at any rate, all I could see, feel, experience were the flaws of the series. All of the good stuff is in book, well, 1 principally, but okay, fine, book 1 and 2. So I would recommend you read this as a duology, quite frankly. So it was a mixed bag. Still, I'm definitely glad I read this trilogy at least once in my life. Then again, I think it was in June, I read William Gibson's Neuromancer, book 1 of the Sprawl trilogy, a now classic of science fiction, and more specifically than that, cyberpunk science fiction dystopia. I principally read it because it is considered a classic, and because a dear friend of mine is very into the cyberpunk subgenre, and it was a mixed bag. I think it merits its status as a classic from a historical document perspective, because as a quick reminder, I divide classics into two broad categories: historical documents and then classic stories that just stand the test of time because of their themes, the emotions they convey, etc. So for me, Neuromancer is a historical document type classic. It, yeah, definitely cemented the cyberpunk subgenre, definitely on an aesthetic level, but that's where my issues came in. I mostly got vibes out of Neuromancer, aesthetics. They were well-realized vibes and aesthetics, don't get me wrong. I wanted more in terms of theming, world-building maybe a little. I mean, I'm not gaga about cyberpunk in any case, but still, the pacing of the plot as well was pretty rough in places, and the ending of the book felt very disappointing, which is pointless, and it kind of gives into those edgy nihilistic vibes, which, hey, to each their own, it's just not my thing. I wouldn't particularly recommend this one unless you're just, yeah, big fan of cyberpunk, or, you know, you're interested in science fiction and fantasy literature as a broader topic outside of actually, you know, reading stories you will personally enjoy. Back in May, I think it was, I read Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things. This is general fiction which is considered specifically literary, though again, as a quick reminder, I'm just not using that adjective anymore to refer to high-flying prose and general fiction, really, because literary means of it being literature. I had mixed feelings about it. Without really going into any detail, it kind of recounts a set of family tragedies centering on a pair of dizygotic twins called Rahel and Esther in Kerala, in India in the 1960s and 70s, I believe. I mean, it looks at their lives. So part of the book is set during their childhood. Part of the book is set when Rahel is like 30-something years old and she comes back to her native town in Kerala. And so yes, plot-wise and theming-wise, it spirals around a set of family tragedies. And it's quite moving in places, I will give it that. I love the ending because I felt it fit perfectly with the theming around familial tragedy, the value of love in the face of tragedy and things of that nature. But I'm also not a fan of stories that center on child characters or stories that very strongly feature a child's perception of the world. And also the prose bug me a teensy bit in places. It plays around with like experimental prose in a way, and in a way that wasn't to my preference. Because like this book gets a lot of praise for its beautiful prose. For me, it was like, it was okay. So make of that what you will. I would still recommend this, honestly, because there is good theming in there, and it conveys deep and painful human emotions in a way that I found very effective. It's just, at the outset, not really my kind of thing, not my kind of story. Moving on to a quartet of sci-fi novellas I read, and partly reread actually, in August, Our Vitreous Womb, written by Haldane B. Doyle. And yes, I am friends with the author, and I actually beta read, well, at least the very first of his novellas, so it's kind of special to me in that regard. I didn't love his quartet. I enjoyed aspects of it. It's definitely ideas-driven sci-fi that takes place in the far future and features, well, neo-humans is what I'm going to call them. Individuals who are no longer quite Homo sapienses, and in fact, standard humans are referred to as sapienses. So it plays around with evolution as a theme, with artificial selection, eugenics even, yes, and alternative social structures. You can read it as a utopian proposal, you can read it as a dystopian proposal. I read it, yes, as a dystopia for the kind of person I am. But so it does play with big ideas in a way that I found effective, especially given the novella format. So I would recommend you give it a shot if it sounds vaguely interesting. Maybe watch my review first to get a better idea of what it's about. But most of all, it was just really nice to be part of that journey with my friend, so yeah, I obviously had to mention it again. Then last November, I read Seanan McGuire's Middlegame. This is a book I picked up once again because of my David, who had spoken decently highly of it and said I would probably enjoy it. And well, fuck me if he wasn't right. I really enjoy this because, whilst yes, it is a story that heavily focuses on an alchemy motif, at least for its plot and magical, esoterical world building. I mean, it doesn't go super in depth, but it was still pretty well done overall, I will give it that. It also features a love story, but a platonic one between two siblings. Twins, well, you'll see if you want to, who are the main characters of the book, and they're very much intertwined with the alchemy of it all. And not only did I really love the platonic love story, I found it really beautiful. The characters, I mean the main characters, can be read as neurodivergent if you want. I consider them neurodivergent coded, especially the female character. I read her straight up autistic, and both are definitely intellectually gifted. And the female character especially has a very hard time growing up and feels very alone, very depressed. So, you know, that kind of stuff always speaks to me. So that paired with the beautiful love that bound her to her brother, I don't know, it hit me in the feels. And again, outside of that, I thought the alchemy motif was pretty well executed, and I really enjoy that because it's a branch of esotericism I haven't seen much of in literature until now. During most of November, I also read Hilary Mantel's Cromwell trilogy, which comprises Book 1, Wolf Hall, Book 2, Bring Up the Bodies, and Book 3, The Mirror and the Light. It's historical fiction that focuses on the life of Thomas Cromwell in the Tudor court of King Henry VIII. And it also features a lot of commentary, not world building, you know what I mean, like historical building. You get what I mean, about the Protestant Reformation, England breaking away from the Catholic Church, all that stuff. And it has pretty good theming too on societal change, or rather enacting societal change on a very large scale. What kind of price are you willing to pay to make that happen? Do the ends justify the means, etc., etc., especially since Thomas Cromwell is portrayed by Mantel as a fairly grey character, but a fascinating character, fascinating man. It also, in my opinion, has superb character work, very deep character work. It really helped that I listened to a very, very large part of this trilogy on audio, because whilst this trilogy has a fair few qualities, it's also not really my kind of thing. I do like a bit of historical fiction, but Tudor England isn't specifically a topic of interest, or period of interest rather, and I guess if I'm going to read about political machinations, I'd rather do it with a heavy coating of fancy a la A Song of Ice and Fire. And at times I just didn't really care about some of the characters, or the theme. No, I liked the theming, but it also wasn't specifically really my thing. Still, I really liked the ending, found it surprisingly moving, and yeah, it just left me with a really good and satisfied feeling. So this is once again an example of a trilogy I probably won't ever reread, but I'm very glad I read it at least once. And then the penultimate thing I read in 2023 was Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. She be a chunky bitch. This is another book I believe I was recommended by David, and definitely encouraged to read by my bestest bookish friend. This is light fantasy that is written as basically a 19th century novel, and it features magic and like fairy shenanigans, fairy folklore, and I enjoyed it well enough. Yeah, I enjoyed the characters quite a bit. I enjoyed the fairy shenanigans, but it was very long. For me, it was too long. I just don't really understand why this story had to be 1,000 pages long. It dragged in places once again. The audiobook version came to my rescue and helped me to finish this chunky dish. And honestly, I also didn't get much in terms of theming or deeper world building. And yes, despite the footnotes. Still, once again, this is a book I'm glad I read at least once in my life. Would I ever reread it? It's not completely off the table, but probably not, and certainly not anytime soon. Now, let me talk about the worst things I read in 2023. First, I will pair and mention Rivers Solomon's Sorrowland and Claire Oshetsky Chouette, primarily because it is, more or less, because of these two books that I have now firmly concluded magical realism and its adjacent subgenres, like what I call magical science fiction, etc., is just not for me. Sorrowland featured fungal shenanigans and a character who is infected by a shroom that gives her superpowers is kind of the gist of it, but that was painfully underutilized and just very gimmicky. The character work was poor and the theming very surface level and a bit too angry. For my personal taste, at any rate, but to each their own. And Chouette featured a woman who gets pregnant with an owl baby. Literally, maybe. Still not entirely sure about that one, but either way, its story and theming suffered from the fact it overcommitted, in my opinion, to its central metaphor. Because the owl baby is kind of a stand-in for kids with special needs, and the main character's experience with motherhood, which is horrific, is a stand-in for motherhood as a difficult experience. But it just, because of this owl baby thing, it didn't work. It just didn't work. It got trippy and violent towards the end, and it's like, okay, fine, you know what, magical realism is just not for me, apparently. I'm sure there must be exceptions out there, but because of these two, I am not touching magical realism again unless it comes super freaking highly recommended. Now I'll mention the worst reread of 2023. It was none other than Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, which I read in May, I believe, and whoa, I couldn't with the drama of it all. There was so much drama, tedious drama I had zero interest in, and then the freaking toxic romance with freaking Heathcliff, who can go fuck himself. Like, if I'm gonna indulge in that kind of character drama, I have other and infinitely better avenues to explore to get me some of that. But so, I will never reread Wuthering Heights, that's for sure. Moving on to the worst sequel I read in 2023, and I'm still really kind of sad about that one. Because yeah, it was also the biggest disappointment, quite frankly, of 2023, and it was Adrian Tchaikovsky's Children of Memory, Book 3 in his Children of Time series. This one has genetically uplifted corvids, and they sucked. As a big bird nerd and lover, I was like, not about that at all. I was mad. And then the plot was a mess. Structurally, and even from a just giving a shit point of view. And on the theming front, oh wow, I mean, Children of Memory really moved away hard from that oh so delicious speculative evolutionary zoology and just went ham, in a bad way in this case, with exploring consciousness, kind of artificial consciousness, artificial personalities, and even then, I don't know, I mean, I can't spoil anything, right? But it just got lost in the sauce, is how I would put it. And so yeah, massive, massive letdown. Wow. And now we come to the final two, the worst of 2024, 2 new reads, or, well, technically 5 new reads, because first I must mention yet again, oh yes, the Book of the New Sun, written by Gene Wolfe. This, as you can see, is published in the Science Fiction Masterworks edition, because it's considered a classic of SFF, and, you know, literary classic of SFF, sod right off with that labeling. I would contend it's more science fantasy than anything else, but whatever. It's far future kind of apocalyptic fiction, because it has a dying Earth trope, and it centers on a hateful main character called Severian. He certainly was Severianing everywhere. There's a decent bit of hashtag men writing women in here, in my opinion. Okay, make of that what you will. And the world building is very opaque. The theming wasn't that good, and the whole thing just reeks of style over substance. And I felt very frustrated because I got nothing that I could really enjoy on either a world building or theming front. I wasn't enjoying it by the end of book 2 of the quartet, but I was like, you know, fine, I'll continue. A, because I'm shite at DNFing, right? But B, because I figured, oh, maybe I'll get some sort of plot resolution, and with that extra world building, and at least something in terms of theming, nope. Oh, I was mad when I got to the end. The end was so freaking stupid, don't at me, it was so stupid. But, you know, as always, yay, another couple of SF Masterworks down the hatch and in my little collection, so silver linings. And finally, look who it is again. Blindside by Peter Watts. Yes, I read that in October, I believe, because it is technically First Contact science fiction horror that features aliens who are super schmort without being conscious, self-aware, what have you. And yes, it is very much so ideas-driven science fiction, I will give it that. I found its theming on consciousness and empathy, or rather lack thereof, those two concepts. Very poor, quite frankly, and I fucking hated that book. The main character was awful. There were massive issues with some aspects of the world building, resurrected prehistoric vampires, and then the theming, because the theming just reeks of edgy nihilism in a way that was so deeply off-putting. Honestly, the aliens of Blindside, they were kind of cool conceptually, sure, but ultimately underwhelming. Now moving on to the pleasant shit. The best of 2023. First, I will mention 3 rereads. First, I reread Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. I was specifically excited to reread Jane Eyre because I wanted to see for myself if I could indeed read Jane Eyre as, obviously unintentionally in this case, autistic or more broadly neurodivergent coded, and I would say yes. So I enjoyed that, and you know what, this time around I actually enjoyed the romance at the heart of it all a lot more. And yes, it kind of works as a coming of age narrative, though I'm not really a fan of that. More as an individuation narrative, which I find more interesting, and yes, there is a bit of proto-feminist theming as well, so it's so good in my book. I was once again in the beautiful realm of properly feminist, ideas-driven SFF. First, there was Sherry S. Tapper's The Gate to Women's Country. This is a book I first read in like 2017, I believe, and I enjoyed it all the more upon first reread. This takes place in the not so near future after some sort of nuclear apocalypse and features a matrifocal or matristic society that is partly sex segregated. There is very good theming on gender, sex, relationships between men and women, male pattern violence, certainly, but also societal change. What are you willing to do to enact societal change? Ethically questionable things like eugenics pop up in here as well, so it's a challenging read in certain respects, but then I also found it moving. I enjoyed the main character and I thought she was the perfect main character for that kind of story. I also found the length of this absolutely perfect this time around. It was just such a lovely feeling. I was like, perfectly contained, standalone, ideas-driven feminist SFF. Yes, please, I need more of this in my life. And so, the second one I reread was Marge Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time. Here again, properly, well, less focusedly feminist, ideas-driven SFF, more concerned with like intersectional feminism, like the intersection of different axes of oppression. There's also commentary on mental health and psychiatric ableism, and this is also actual utopian fiction. The author just went for it and created a possible utopia set in the future. There is a bit of time traveling in the story, though it's mental time travel. And whilst I had issues on the world building front and issues with the author's utopian proposal, I love the fact that the author dared to create something like this. It asks hard questions, just like The Gate to Women's Country does, and it just doesn't shy away from offering up answers. You don't have to agree with them, but the book invites you to think and feel as well in relation to the thinking. So that's what I really like with both of these, to be honest. There's like proper intellectual engagement, but there's also emotional engagement. It's the best kind of ideas-driven SFF, quite frankly, and I would very much wholeheartedly recommend both of these. Now on to the best sequels I read in 2023, and we have 2 very strong entries. Actually, at the very beginning of last year, I read Feral Creatures, written by Kira Jane Buxton. This is the sequel to my beloved Hollow Kingdom, which is a new, well, I mean newish now, all-time SFF favorite. That was a 10 out of 10 read for me. This was a 9 out of 10, so very freaking strong sequel. The theming was still on point, I felt all the feels, but it wasn't quite as perfectly balanced as all things should be as book 1 with its theming, but still 9 out of freaking 10. So I would very, very, very highly recommend you pick this one up if you adored Hollow Kingdom. And the other sequel I loved was The Magician King, written by Lev Grossman. This is book 2 of the Magician's trilogy, with book 1 being The Magician, which I first read in 2022, and it subsequently became an all-time fancy favorite of mine. It continues with a lot of the qualities present in book 1. I enjoyed the cast of characters, I enjoyed the theming, dark humor riffing off of other works of fancy, and also you get some quality time and a backstory for a character you only kind of glimpse in book 1, Julia, a nerdy, goth witch queen I read as autistic or neurodivergent coded. Unfortunately, there was a very genuinely problematic element in The Magician King. It kind of falls into the category of hashtag men not handling sexual violence well in the narrative. I won't say more than that, obviously. Oh, that marred my enjoyment a lot. I was able to put that to the side partly, so this was still an 8 out of 10 for me. I would still recommend this as a sequel to The Magicians, but do keep in mind there's a very not okay thing in it. Now onto new reads. In the spring, I read Renee Denfeld's The Enchanted. This is a new soft general fiction favorite actually, and it was also a gift from my bestest bookish friend. This is quite dark because the story takes place in and around death row, and it's told by an inmate who seems strangely omniscient. And it also follows a woman who does research for lawyers in order to get inmates off of death row but back into life imprisonment, because the vast majority of her clients are actually guilty of the often very violent crimes. So there is a lot of theming on the cycle of abuse and violence, the origins of violent crime, the justice system, how we value life in the light of horrific acts of violence, etc., etc. And whilst it deals with the very dark aspects of the human psyche, I found this story quietly powerful and full of a certain light, actually, because there's a lot of hope and deep compassion in this book. I read a solid third of this with tears running down my face. I did not expect this at all, so this was a very pleasant surprise. So a very dark read, but very beautiful at the same time. Back in the realm of SFF, I also read John Scalzi's The Kaiju Preservation Society, and that was so much fun, as it says on the tin. And the story features rather nerdy scientists and non-scientists who work for an organization, the aim of which is to preserve kaiju. As like, well, not really animals, but living beings in a parallel version of Earth. It relies on a lot of like very nerdy humor and so many nerdy references, something which The Magicians does as well and which I freaking loved, and here it just worked. If I had to like pitch this with movie references or movie and TV references, I would say this felt like a cross between The Big Bang Theory, Pacific Rim, and Tropic freaking Thunder. Fucking yes! Then in September or October, I read Kelly Barnhill's When Women Were Dragons, a genuine example of contemporary feminist SFF. The story takes place in a version of our world where women can dragon under certain circumstances. And by dragon, it means what you think. They can literally transform into dragons. And this has been kept secret for a very long time, and the government tries to cover this up when there's a mass dragoning event in the 1950s in the United States, and I was pleasantly surprised by the theming. There is quite a bit in this book about, well, feminist issues, about violence and silencing women experience in their lives, specifically their domestic lives, what the toll this takes on women's psyches and sense of self and sense of self-worth. And that's kind of where the dragoning comes in. I'll admit the dragoning works pretty heavily as a metaphor for like female rage and pain from oppression and discrimination. There was also really good commentary on bias in the life sciences, which is quite a lot in this relatively short book. And then it was all rather moving. It's quite poetic in places and just, yeah, genuinely moving. I also read, finally, The Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss. These were yet again given to me by my bestest bookish friend. I was very pleasantly surprised because this turned out to be a new fantasy favorite. I was shocked. I don't know, I guess because I've been burned before, I went in with lower expectations. I also listened to these books, or I mean a large part of them, on audio, and the audiobook narration was excellent. I enjoyed the characters, their relationships, but then there is also good theming and interesting world building, a lot of lovely writing, and very nice commentary on mental health, mental difference. It sits in a very interesting tonal spot as well, somewhere between the Legendarium and the Song of Ice and Fire, so it's something I hadn't encountered much of before, so that was really nice as well. Also, I must mention, I read this as well. Which is part of the greater Kingkiller canon, I guess. This was so lovely, though it felt more like a piece of music in literary form than anything else, which is not a negative, to be clear, which is different. I can't really, in good conscience, recommend another big, chunky fantasy series that isn't completed. But still, what there is, I think, is beautiful and worthwhile and immersive, and I loved it, so make of that what you will. And finally, I will mention a new horror favorite. It's a bit of a joker card though, because I do consider graphic fiction kind of separate from fiction literature. That's just how I see it. But I could not mention freaking Uzumaki, written and illustrated by Junji Ito. This was so freaking good, holy shit. This story spirals around spirals. Takes place in a little Japanese town, follows two teenage characters, or I mean more specifically a main female teenage character, and shit gets trippy and freaky and horrific, all following the central motif of the spiral and its potential eldritchy roots. Dun dun dun! Just near perfect, cosmic, oh hell yeah, body and psychological horror. The art was stellar, to be honest, and I used to have a kind of bias against the manga art tradition, or I guess the Japanese art tradition. Fuck my previous self, because honestly, I love the art in this. It was so good. Some things were just a tad too goofy for my taste, but otherwise, yeah, 9 out of 10, no question. And so what about this coming year? I do want to do a few rereads, as I always do. I can never remember, is it The Picture or The Portrait of Dorian Gray? That, by Oscar Wilde, obviously. The Color Purple by Alice Walker. The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. And then this should be so much fun. I'm going to reread the Harry Potter series. I've never done it before. I've never read those books as an adult. And then I do want to get to a few additional books my ex recommended to me. I already read Tigana by Guy Gavriel Kay. I'll talk more about it in my January reading wrap-up. Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. I am reading it right now. It's challenging my will to live. Wow, but more on that later. I will be reading Crime and Punishment because I must read a Dostoevsky novel. I will be reading, well, the first Law trilogy. I don't expect to love it, but I don't expect to hate it either. And then at least the first 3 books of the Malazan Books of the Fallen series. That should be interesting. I don't really know what I'll make of them based on the information I already have about this series. We'll see. And then additionally, I have China Mieville's back catalogue to go through. Very much looking forward to that because I have at least 4 books, I think. Yes, 4 books to go through. Yay! I'd also like to read a few more feminist SFF books by various authors, especially authors I haven't tried yet. I'll be reading more Junji Ito because I need that shit in my life. And I just might squeeze in Berserk, the manga series, because my bestest bookish friend has beat me to it. I'm salty about that. I'm having massive FOMO. So yeah, it's just a question of when will I fit that in? But I would like to read the series. I sincerely hope you all had a more good than not 2023, and I hope that 2024 will be good for you as well. But on that final note, I hope you will have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves. Thank you for the continued support, and I shall see you all reasonably soon in another couple of videos. But until then, bye bye.